The county recorder's office in Kingman sat in a building that smelled of old carpet and central heat, and on a Tuesday morning in October of 2019, the conference room on the second floor held 6 people around a pressed wood table. There was the recorder's deputy, a young woman named Shelley who kept clicking her pen without noticing. There was a title company representative from Wichita who had driven out that morning and would drive back by noon. There was Marcus Webb, 26 years old, with clean hands that still showed the ghost of a callus line across the palm, sitting straight in his chair the way people sit when they are about to sign something that will change their life. There was Connie Ford in her good blouse, the one she kept for church on occasions like this. And there was Glenn Ford, 74 years old, in the same canvas work jacket he had worn to the elevator 3 days before, with a smear of grease near the left pocket that he had not noticed or had noticed and not cared about. He held a pen the deputy handed him, and he looked at the deed for a long moment, not reading it, just letting the weight of the paper settle into his hands. In the back row of chairs against the wall, where someone had arranged 4 seats for observers, Dale Ennis sat alone. He was 68 years old and had been retired from the Hudson Implement dealership for 3 years. He wore a clean shirt and pressed trousers, and his hair was white now and combed. He had driven over from Pratt because he had heard about the signing through the County Farm Bureau newsletter, and had felt, for reasons he probably could not have named clearly, that he ought to be there. He said nothing. He watched Glenn sign his name to the deed, transferring 160 acres of prime Reno County dryland ground to Marcus Webb at a price that was $42,000 below the county appraised value. He watched Glenn set the pen down and push the deed gently across the table. He watched Marcus pick it up and hold it the way someone holds something they plan to carry carefully for the rest of their life. Dale did not speak. That silence was the whole story, in a way. But let me tell you how it got there, because the distance between that silence and where things started is the only part that matters. Glenn Ford grew up on 320 acres of wheat and grain sorghum ground, 12 miles southeast of Hutchinson, in the flat, hard-working country where the soil runs dark brown and the sky in August sits on your shoulders like a wet coat. His father, Eldon, was not a talkative man. He fixed what broke, planted what the ground could carry, and kept his accounts in a composition notebook that lived in the kitchen drawer to the left of the silverware. Glenn had watched him open that notebook every Sunday evening for as long as he could remember, adding a column of figures in pencil, erasing when something changed, never in pen until a number was certain. In the spring of 1974, when Glenn was 29 years old, Eldon drove him to a farm auction 12 miles north, near the little town of Plevna. The farm belonged to a man named Calloway, who had borrowed against 2 pieces of ground and a full line of equipment at rates that had seemed manageable in 1969 and had stopped seeming manageable by 1973. Glenn stood at the edge of the crowd and watched Calloway's Oliver combined sell for $6,300 to a buyer from Nickerson, and he watched Calloway's wife stand near the fence with her arms folded and her eyes somewhere past the tree line. On the drive home, Eldon was quiet for most of the 12 miles, and Glenn did not push him. When they turned onto the county road that led to their lane, Eldon said one sentence. He said it the way a man says something he has been composing for the entire drive, and he said it without looking away from the road. He said, "Own your iron. Owe nobody for your seed, and wait for your land to come to you." Glenn did not write it down. He did not need to. It settled into the part of his memory where things go that arrive with the right weight at the right moment, and it stayed there for the next 45 years. Here is what Glenn's farming life looked like in practice between 1975 and 1982. He worked 320 acres, all of it his by inheritance and all of it paid for. He owned a 1968 Massey Ferguson 1080 that he had bought used for $4,200 from an estate sale in Stafford County in the spring of 1976. He owned a 1971 John Deere 440 combine that he had rebuilt the feeder house on twice and knew well enough to diagnose by the pitch of its cylinder. He saved wheat seed from his own bins in years when the variety held true, and when he needed certified seed, he bought it with cash at the co-op in early winter when the price was lowest. He carried no operating loan. He did not finance inputs. When he needed parts, he paid for them the week he needed them, and when he did not have the cash, he waited until he did. This was not asceticism. It was arithmetic. The people who noticed Glenn's operation and formed an opinion about it usually noticed the equipment first. The 1080 tractor was red and faded in places, and the cab had a crack in the rear window that he had sealed with a strip of weatherproofing tape. The combine was green and had a new paint patch on the right side of the grain tank, where he had repaired a crack in 1978. He drove a 1972 Chevrolet pickup, white, with 214,000 miles on it by 1980, and he did not appear to be in any hurry to replace it. Dale Ennis had been selling equipment out of the Hudson dealership on the south edge of Hutchinson since 1971. He was good at it. He had a wide, confident handshake, a recall for names that made customers feel known, and a genuine enthusiasm for new iron that was not entirely manufactured. He believed in what he sold. He believed that a man farming 300 acres with 1968 equipment was leaving yield on the table, and he believed this not out of greed, but out of the honest conviction that newer, larger, better capitalized was the direction American agriculture was traveling, and that anyone who was not traveling with it was going to be left on the shoulder. In the fall of 1979, Glenn stopped at the Hudson dealership to price a replacement cylinder bar for his combine. Dale was behind the parts counter that day, filling in because the parts manager had gone home sick. He priced the cylinder bar and wrote the order. And while he was writing, he looked up at Glenn and, in the easy, almost fraternal tone of a man who thinks he is offering honest counsel, said, "Glenn, when are you going to let me put you in something that doesn't require a translator to start?" Glenn said, "The one I've got starts fine." Dale set his pen down and smiled, the way a man smiles when he is about to say something that a group of people he imagines behind him will find reasonable. He said, "You are the stubbornest poor man in Reno County, Glenn Ford. I say that with affection." Glenn paid for the cylinder bar in cash and drove home. He did not tell Connie about it that evening. He told her about the cylinder bar and the cost and what the repair would involve. The other thing he folded quietly and put away. Now let me tell you about Roy Ford, because Roy is the part of this story that could have gone differently, and almost did. Roy was 6 years younger than Glenn, and had grown up on the same 320 acres watching the same Sunday night arithmetic. He had absorbed some of it and set some of it aside. He was not reckless. He worked hard and he farmed well, and he understood equipment and soil. What he also understood, or believed he understood, was that the early 1980s represented an opportunity that a man of patience and discipline could capitalize on if he was willing to use the leverage the banks were offering. In 1982, Roy signed a note for 600 acres of new ground north of Kingman, along with a full fleet of new equipment: a four-wheel drive tractor, a new combine, a grain cart, a chisel plow, and a set of field cultivators. The equipment loan and the land note together came to just over $340,000. The interest rate on the equipment note was 14%. The land note was floating, tied to the prime rate, which was also sitting north of 12% in the spring of 1982. Glenn had listened to Roy describe the deal at the kitchen table in February of that year. He had not argued. He had asked two questions. He asked what the carrying cost was going to be in a year when wheat came in at $2.50 a bushel. Roy had an answer for that. He asked what the carrying cost was going to be if the rate stayed at 14% for 3 years instead of 1. Roy had a less confident answer for that, and the confidence he did have was borrowed from the general assumption that rates would come down before the math became unmanageable. Glenn did not say, "You are making a mistake." He said, "All right," and he meant it the way a man means it when he is not going to spend his brother's goodwill arguing about a decision that has already been made. Roy's first 3 years went adequately. Wheat prices held near enough to make the payments, and Roy's farming ability kept his yields respectable. He bought a new truck in 1983 and a used grain bin system in 1984, and from the road his operation had the look of a man doing well. Glenn drove his 1972 Chevrolet past Roy's lane on the way to the elevator and noticed the new equipment sitting clean in the shed, and did not say anything to anyone about the difference. It was in the spring of 1985 that Roy called Glenn on a Sunday evening and asked if Glenn would be interested in buying his first 80 acres, the home quarter he had owned before the expansion. Roy needed liquidity. 2 payment cycles had come in tighter than the projections, and he needed room. Glenn drove over the following Tuesday, looked at the ground, and paid Roy a fair price, $48,000, which was the going rate for that class of dryland ground in Reno County in 1985, not a dollar less, because Glenn was not interested in profiting from his brother's difficulty, and Roy knew it. They signed the papers at a title company in Hutchinson on a Thursday afternoon and shook hands in the parking lot and did not make more of it than it was. Glenn's land base stood at 400 acres after that purchase. He added the 80 to his wheat rotation and kept farming the way he had always farmed, which was the only way he knew. The following year, in the spring of 1986, Glenn heard from a neighbor named Harlan Buell what Dale Ennis had said at the co-op counter in Kingman on a Saturday morning in March. Harlan had been there for a sack of mineral supplement and had heard the whole thing. A group of men had been talking about the farm credit situation, about who was carrying how much debt and at what rate, and someone had mentioned Glenn Ford's operation as an example of a man who had stayed small and conservative, which was a polite way of saying Glenn had not grown the way the decade had suggested a man should grow. Dale, who had been there picking up a payroll check from the co-op's equipment affiliate, had set his coffee cup on the counter and said, with the mild pity of a man stating a fact about someone he had long since written off, "Glenn Ford is never going to amount to anything. He farms like it's 1955, and he's proud of it. Good man, but not going anywhere." Harlan told Glenn this on the phone with the careful hesitation of someone who is not sure whether delivering a thing's worse than letting it arrive some other way. Glenn thanked him and said he appreciated knowing. He hung up the telephone and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and Connie looked at him from across the room without asking, because she had been married to this man for 12 years, and she could read his silences the way she could read weather. He told her what Dale had said. She did not say anything either. She turned back to what she had been doing, and after a moment she said, "Well, there it is again." Glenn said, "There it is." Meanwhile, Roy's situation was tightening the way a wet rope tightens. By 1987, the floating rate on his land note had not come down as far as the projections had predicted, and his equipment loan at 14% was entering its fifth year, still carrying a balance that the early payments had only dented. Wheat in 1986 had come in at $2.30 a bushel. His yields on the new 600 acres were not bad, but they were not the 80-bushel miracle the projections had imagined in their optimistic column. He was current on his payments, but current the way a man is current, when he is spending down his margin rather than building it. By 1988, the farm credit crisis had moved from something you read about in the Hutchinson News to something you watched happen to the farms around you. Foreclosure notices were showing up in the county recorder's public filings with a regularity that made them feel almost ordinary, which was the most unsettling thing about them, that they could become ordinary. Glenn knew 3 families within 8 miles who lost ground that year, and he knew 2 more who gave it back to the bank before the bank could formally ask for it. Roy held on through 1988. He sold most of his new equipment fleet in the winter of that year, taking what the depreciated market would give him, which was considerably less than the notes he had originally signed. He kept the 4-wheel drive tractor because he needed it to farm, and because selling it would have meant admitting something final. He renegotiated his land note in the spring of 1989 with the Federal Land Bank, and for a few months it looked as though he might thread through. Then August came in dry, and the sorghum on the new ground finished short of any number that would help him. He lost the 600 acres in the spring of 1990. Glenn drove up to his brother's house the evening Roy got the letter from the bank and sat at Roy's kitchen table for 2 hours. Roy was not crying, but he had the look of a man who had been crying and had stopped because there was nothing left to push against. He said, after a long silence, "I should have asked you more questions in 1982. He said it in the fragmented way of someone who means more than the sentence holds, and Glenn did not improve on it. He said, "You asked 2 good ones," and then neither of them said anything for a while. Glenn helped Roy move what equipment remained to a rented place south of Pratt, where Roy would farm 400 acres on shares for the next decade. It was good ground, and the arrangement was honest, and Roy was a capable enough farmer that he built something back from it, slowly and with the specific patience that comes from having already learned the other way. Glenn drove home from Roy's new place that first evening, with the truck window down and the smell of turned ground coming off the field in the dark, and he thought about Eldon's sentence the whole way, not with satisfaction, because there was nothing in Roy's loss that warranted satisfaction. He thought about it because it was simply the truest thing he knew about farming, and his brother had just paid the full price for not having held it early enough. Glenn's land base in 1992 sat at 480 acres, all paid for, after a quiet purchase of 40 more acres from an estate south of his home place in 1991. He had made that purchase with cash he had saved across the previous 3 years, while every other operator in the county had been tightening belts and refinancing and watching the mail. The seller was the widow of a farmer named Baird, and she needed a settled price without contingency, and Glenn gave her one. 480 acres of dryland wheat and grain sorghum ground in Reno County, free and clear, with a paid-off equipment line and a savings passbook that Connie kept in the kitchen drawer next to the silverware, to the left of the composition notebook that had once been Eldon's. There was one night in the late fall of 1989 when the certainty loosened a little. Glenn had been out late checking the wheat emergence on the south field after a dry October, and he came in to find Connie at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her and a cup of coffee gone cold beside it. He sat down across from her, and she looked at him in the particular way she had when she was going to say a true thing she had been holding back. She said, "Do you ever wonder if we traded too much?" She did not mean Roy. She meant the years of not expanding when expanding was possible. The dinners they had not gone to because they were watching the budget. The years of driving the 1972 Chevrolet while everyone around them drove something newer, and the silence of it. The way a quiet choice makes noise over time. Glenn looked at the ledger. He looked at the numbers, which were modest and clean and pointed in one direction. He said, "Some nights." Then he said, "But the ground doesn't lie." She nodded once and closed the ledger, and they went to bed. He replaced equipment when he needed to, paid cash, and kept farming through the 90s and into the next century with the unhurried consistency of a man who has decided what he is going to do and sees no reason to revisit it each morning. Wheat prices cycled. Diesel prices cycled. The county around him changed in the way rural Kansas counties change, slowly and with a kind of dignity that you notice more when you have been watching for 30 years. Neighbors sold, neighbors retired. Ground that had been in family operation since statehood moved into corporate portfolios, and Glenn watched this without complaint because it was not his business to manage other people's decisions. He managed 320 of his own acres directly and cash rented the remaining 160 to a reliable tenant named Dwayne Schultz, who farmed it well and paid on time and never asked Glenn for more than was in their agreement. By 2008, Glenn and Connie's net worth, assembled through 33 years of the same practice applied without deviation, sat at $1.4 million. All of it was land and equipment. There was no paper in it, no speculative position, no market account bought on margin. There was 480 acres of Reno County ground, a paid-off equipment line that included a 2001 AGCO tractor and a 1997 Case combine, both purchased with cash in the years they were needed, and a savings position that Glenn had never described to anyone who had not asked him directly. The number appeared in the spring of 2008 in a presentation that Walter Pruitt put together for the Reno County Farm Bureau meeting held at the 4-H building south of Hutchinson. Walter Pruitt was the county extension agent and had been watching Glenn's operation with professional interest for about 15 years. He was not the kind of man who made a fuss about what he noticed, but he was thorough, and he had put together a presentation on what he called conservative equity farming in the Kansas dryland belt. He used Glenn as his primary case study, by name with Glenn's permission, and he walked the room through the ledger the way you walk someone through a completed puzzle, showing the individual pieces before the picture. He showed the land basis, the equipment depreciation, the savings accumulation, the absence of debt service across the full period from 1982 forward. He showed the number at the end. Dale Ennis was in that room. He was sitting 3 rows back on the left side, and he had come because the Farm Bureau meeting was something he had attended most years out of professional habit, and also because he was still selling equipment at Hudson, though he was slowing down and everyone knew it. He heard Walter say the number. He heard it attributed by name. He sat with his hands on his thighs, and he looked at the front of the room for a moment in a way that the people nearby could not have described precisely, but would have recognized if they had been watching. He did not say anything at the meeting. He drove home, and he would think about that presentation and about the number for a long time. Glenn drove home from the same meeting in the truck he was driving at that point, a 2003 Dodge with 167,000 miles on it, and he told Connie about it over supper. She asked if people seemed surprised. He said some did. She said, "Good." Then she put his plate in front of him, and they ate. Marcus Webb had come to Glenn in the summer of 2012, and what Glenn had noticed first about Marcus was that he asked questions the way a person asks questions who is genuinely trying to understand the answer, and not just the confirmation of what he already thought. He was 26, farming 200 acres on a rented ground with a thin equipment line he had cobbled together from estate sales and a private loan from his uncle that he was paying back ahead of schedule. He wanted to know if Glenn had any ground available. Glenn said he might, in time. He invited Marcus to come back in the fall, and they would talk numbers. Marcus came back in October, and what followed over the next 2 years was less a negotiation than an education. Glenn let Marcus farm 40 acres of the home place on shares in 2013, showing him the ground, the rotation, the tiling situation on the east end that required a specific planting order. He watched Marcus work. Marcus worked the way Glenn had worked at his age, which was to say he worked as though the ground belonged to him already, and he was only waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. He saved seed from his bins. He kept his own notebook, a spiral-bound thing he carried in his back pocket, with dates and observations and input costs in his own shorthand. Glenn saw the notebook the first autumn, and recognized it the way you recognize something you own. By 2014, Glenn had structured a formal cash lease arrangement with Marcus, covering 160 acres of the home place, with a first right of purchase written into the lease at a price they set together, a price that reflected what Glenn thought the ground was worth to a young man who was going to farm it right rather than what it would bring at an auction to a corporate buyer from outside the county. They shook hands on it at the kitchen table while Connie poured coffee. The notebook sat open beside Marcus's cup, his own observations filling the pages the way Eldon's pencil had filled the composition notebook in the kitchen drawer 40 years before. Glenn and Marcus talked about the work the way men talk about work they both love, in the specific and unhurried register of people who find the practical details interesting and not merely utilitarian. Glenn talked about seed selection the way Eldon had talked about it, not as a cost-saving measure, but as a form of attention, knowing your own ground well enough to save from it. He talked about debt the way a man talks about something that has never tempted him personally, but that he has watched do serious damage to people he cared about. He said, one evening when they were sitting on the tailgate of Glenn's truck after checking the winter wheat emergence on the north end of the lease ground, "Roy's a good farmer. He lost ground not because he was stupid, but because the carrying cost of the debt didn't leave him any margin when the bad years came, and the bad years always come." Marcus said, "How do you protect against that?" Glenn said, "You own your iron. You owe nobody for your seed, and you wait for your land to come to you. That's it." Marcus looked at him for a moment and then wrote it down in the spiral notebook, not because he had not heard it before in some form, but because hearing it from Glenn on that particular evening, standing in a field that was going to be his in a few years, made it something worth writing down. The signing in October of 2019 took about 40 minutes, including the title company representative's explanation of the transfer documents and the deputy's pen-clicking, and the moment when Shelley had to go find a notary stamp she had left in the other room. Marcus signed. Glenn signed. Connie sat beside Glenn with her hands folded on the table, and did not sign anything because the ground was in Glenn's name alone, and always had been. But she was there because it would have been wrong to be anywhere else. When everything was complete, and the papers had been assembled, and the title company representative had snapped his briefcase shut and stood up, Marcus stood and put his hand out to Glenn, and Glenn took it. Marcus did not say much. He said, "Thank you, Glenn." He said it the way you say something when the word is too small for what you mean, and you know it, and you say it anyway because it is all you have. Glenn said, "Farm it right." Dale had stood when the others stood. He crossed the room and extended his hand to Glenn in the quiet, slightly deliberate way of a man who has been composing a gesture for a while. Glenn took his hand. Dale said, "You did well, Glenn." He said it simply, without qualification, without the old ease that had once made his confident pronouncements seem like friendly fire. He said it the way a man says the true thing after a long time of saying adjacent things. Glenn said, "Eldon would have liked today." Dale nodded once, and that was all. He picked up his coat from the back row of chairs and walked out of the conference room ahead of everyone else, and if he had anything more to say about it, he kept it. Glenn and Connie drove home in the 2003 Dodge, which now carried 211,000 miles and started every morning without complaint. The harvest equipment was put up for the season, and the wheat was in the ground, and the country along the county road home was the flat, specific, unhurried country it had always been. The kind of country that does not make a fuss about what happens on it and gives nothing away to people who are looking for shortcuts. Roy called that evening from his place south of Pratt. He had been farming rented ground there for 29 years and had built it into something he was proud of. 460 acres on shares with a cash rental piece he had added in 2007. And his equipment line was solid and paid for, bought used and maintained with the same attention he had always had for machinery. He had learned the slow way what Glenn had known from the beginning, and he knew Glenn knew that. And the two of them had never needed to say it plainly, because brothers who have been through what they had been through do not need to rehearse the lesson. Roy asked how the signing had gone. Glenn told him about the room, about Marcus, about Dale standing in the back row. Roy was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I wish Dad could have seen that." Glenn said, "I think he did." They talked for another 20 minutes about Roy's winter wheat establishment and a soil moisture concern on his north piece and the price of ammonium nitrate, which was up again and irritating. Then Roy said goodnight, and Glenn hung up the telephone. Connie had the kitchen lamp on over the table, and the composition notebook was out. The new one, the 32nd in the sequence that went back to Eldon's original, each one filled and replaced and stacked in the drawer when it was done. She was entering the figures from the October accounts, the final lease payment from the 160 acres now transferred, and the inputs for the home operations fall work. The lamp made the kind of small, specific light that a kitchen lamp makes when the rest of the house is dark, and Glenn sat down across from her the way he had been sitting down across from her at that table for 44 years. She finished a column, put the pencil down, and looked up at him. He said, "Marcus will do all right." She said, "I know he will." Outside, the wheat on the home place was 3 inches out of the ground, and even the way good wheat looks in a good fall when you have planted on time with clean seed that you know. The 2003 Dodge sat in the yard where Glenn had parked it, patient and unwashed and ready for tomorrow. The country beyond the yard was dark and flat and enormous, the way it is every night out there, the way it has been since before any of the people in this story were born. Connie turned the lamp down a notch and went back to her column. Glenn sat in his chair and listened to the pencil move. Some things compound quietly for 40 years and then pay out all at once, and the payout looks simple from the outside because simplicity was the whole point. Eldon had known that. Now Marcus knew it too.